All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 15, talking about some advanced production techniques. And this gets, for the most part, a little more involved than what we usually do in radio, but there's some good information here nonetheless. Today, many digital audio workstation programs incorporate multi-track production capabilities within the software setup. These software programs can allow you to mix as many as 128 tracks of audio, and some programs can do even more these days. However, the number of tracks that can be recorded simultaneously is going to be limited by the hardware setup of the computer. So if you have a sound card that only has a stereo input, for example, you can only record 2 tracks at a time, despite the fact that your software can accommodate even more than that. So a good example of that is our studios at CCCC, where you can record onto 1 track at a time, 1 stereo track at a time, I should say. Even though Adobe Audition can handle multiple tracks of audio at any given time. The sound card that we have, the way the studios are set up, we can only record onto 1 stereo track at a time, despite the capabilities of the software. So what is multi-channel? Multi-channel is the idea that the console and the recording device are capable of isolating a number of channels, depending on the channel configuration and the track configuration of the record playback system. Basically, what happens is that you have a separate audio source that can be placed on each of the channels and then mixed into the final product at some later date. And what's nice about this is that when you save to these separate tracks, all of your audio sources remain discrete, they remain isolated from each other, they remain unique. And this allows the producer to balance the sound sources properly when the final mixdown of sources occurs afterwards. So say you're recording a band. You could have the drums on 1 track of audio. You can have the guitar on another track of audio. You can have the keyboards on another track. You can have each vocalist on their own track. And all of that is happening at the same time, which allows for the performance of something to happen in a natural sort of way. But the audio from each individual element keeps its uniqueness and is separate from being mixed into a stereo mix right away when you're doing the recording. And there's all sorts of different advantages to being able to do something like that. First off, each element can be recorded and controlled separately while being recorded at the same time. If an error occurs, only the element in error needs to be recorded. So say the guitarist had a awesome guitar solo, but the vocalist sang off key or something. They could always go back and just re-record the vocalist playing back in his or her headset, whatever the music mix was, and then just dubbing in the correction on the voice. That's one of many examples of how you can use that. A singer can also overdub her or his own voice according to a harmony part, for instance, to a previously recorded song. So you could sing your own harmony, kind of in the same way that we talked about with correcting a singer that was off key. Instruments can be mic'd with different placements on different tracks, giving the producer the ability to choose from several audio perspectives. So not only could you have a certain instrument on each track, but you could have a certain instrument on multiple tracks to be able to hear the drums from one angle and then another angle and so on and so on. Multi-channel consoles also allow sound shaping. That is, a variety of software enhancements or electronic devices can be used to alter the quality of the audio signal both during the recording and during the mixdown. So it gives you a whole lot more freedom to add certain types of effects to certain sounds that are on certain tracks without altering the production as a whole. Some issues to consider with multi-track recording. First, rendering. Rendering is the time it takes to accomplish a specific task. Usually the rendering time is tied to the speed of the computer, the number of channels used by the software, and the number of effects that you put on a sound. In other words, the more complex something is that you are doing, the longer it's going to take to render that project down to a final mixdown. Also, the quality of your equipment is going to take that sort of thing into account. If you've got an older computer, you don't have as much RAM that can process things quickly, that sort of thing. That's also going to impact your rendering time. Speaking of time, another issue is latency. Latency is basically the idea of how much of a delay there is from when something is received to when it is processed. When we talk about it with audio latency, basically we're talking about a delay between the recording and the playback. So generally what happens is that it's going to take a certain amount of time for the computer to sample the audio and then store it and then play back that signal. Think about it in terms of if you've ever talked with someone on a video chat, for example. Sometimes there may be a delay between what you see in the video and what you hear in the audio. That's latency, that delay in between when something actually happens versus when you realize that action taking place. Input modules. MultiTrack consoles use vertical slide faders rather than circular pots. These are easier to see and perceive. They're easier to control when you're dealing with multiple faders in particular, so that, say you had to pot up or pot down several sources at the same time, the sliders make it a whole lot easier as opposed to having to turn several dials. Some input selection controls. You have the mic level and line level selectors. These are to assist if you need a particular fader to use phantom power or not, especially with various types of microphones. Trim control, sometimes called a pre-fade level or a PFL, also commonly called gain. This is a fine level adjustment of the input volume that allows you to keep sliders in position with other channel inputs. And the reason that this is a nice tool is that you can set the gain or the trim control in such a way that when you take your fader for a particular element and slide it up to 0, the signal should be right about at the correct level for that particular element. So if you do that tweaking on the front end with the trim or the gain, that makes it really nice for controlling that particular element so that you don't have to remember where optimum volume is for each particular fader. You can start at 0 and then make minor adjustments as you need to. Sound shapers. An equalizer alters the frequency pattern of an audio source. It can, for example, boost a certain range of frequencies. This allows for differences in low, mid, and high pitch, for example, to be able to balance those out to create a certain type of quality of sound. A filter will eliminate frequencies of a certain range. This is really helpful for perhaps taking out room noise or some kind of a hum or something like that. An effects or auxiliary pot may be found on an input module as well. These allow the engineer to apply special effects like reverberation to a specific channel, especially if you're using different types of sound shapers that are not innate within your digital audio workstation. This is really, really nice to be able to assign certain channels to certain effects, and that gets recorded as things are happening. The pan pot varies the amount of signal sent to each side of the stereo signals. So this would be kind of like when you have in your car stereo the fade control that you can make things come over just your left speakers versus right speakers. Pan is the official term for that. To pan more towards left channel only versus right channel only. The solo mutes other inputs so that the channel being soloed can be heard alone. This is really nice when you're working in a multi-track production so that you could hear the sound quality of just one particular thing without having to pot all of the other elements down. Bus delegation controls are used to send the signals from the input modules to the board's output modules, and those are known as buses, therefore bus delegation. These are buttons that are very similar to the program sends that you have on a radio console if you're sending audio to program or audition or what have you. Bus delegation is very much in the same vein. Output buses. The master 1 output reflects the final mix of all signals and can be sent to the recording machine or saved on the digital audio workstation or sent to the monitors. It's your main mix, if you will. Each output can be controlled with overall volume, or it could have various effects applied. So this is really helpful if you need to send a different type of mix to a certain speaker. This is really helpful in cases of performers where they want to hear something come out of their monitor speaker that emphasizes a certain element or a certain voice or something. You can provide them a customized mix for their purposes. Sometimes if you're in a live setting, for example, where you're outputting product live to an auditorium and you're also recording, sometimes you want the quality of the sound of the recording to be different from what is being sent out over the auditorium because of the way that sound is perceived live versus recorded. That provides that ability when you use the various output buses. Monitor controls. In the multi-track console output area, the signal flow to the loudspeakers is governed by those monitor controls. Simple enough. One other note, the important thing about multi-channel recording is not the technical features that are offered. What you should remember is that multi-channel digital audio workstations and consoles provide great flexibility precisely because they have discrete input and output selections. In other words, when you have the luxury of multi-track recording, you are not at the mercy of having to do retakes of everything every time if there's one mistake in one particular area. You can actually continue on with the project and then just repair whatever particular element needs to be redone. And it's a really, really nice time saver, as well as the opportunity to capture the very best of whatever you're recording, however it comes to you. And if you need to do that piecemeal, you have the luxury of doing that with multi-track recording. Even though you may record only one or two sources at a time, multi-tracking allows the producer to layer one sound on top of another. This is one of the benefits of thinking about a project in advance of when you go into the studio, having a vision for your project, if you will. Because that way you can think about how you want your sound to be shaped and impacted. You can think about the order of operations, I should say, for what sort of things you need to have recorded and laid down first. Say your instrumentalist has the ability to come in and pre-record before the vocalist does. That way the vocalist can sing to the track that's already recorded. That is very, very helpful and very time efficient. Some radio producers also have the responsibility of music recording. We've spent a lot of time talking about that. That's one of the main uses of multi-track recording. What you may find in radio applications is, say, a band comes in to do a couple of live cuts during the morning show, for example, and you can record those sessions while you are putting that out on the air. And that provides some really cool, basically different progressions, different versions of songs that you can say were recorded in your studios and have it to do some editing and fixing up and then re-rendering that and making it available for your audience after the live performance. Real quick about stereo. Stereophonic sound gives a sense of depth and locale to the program material in much the same way as two ears or two eyes give a sense of depth. Not depth, but depth. Stereo gives a feeling of location in space because of the differences in sound between the left and right channels. We can perceive with our ears distance, spatial relations, and stereo sound gives us the ability to do that. Even more so in more advanced studios where you're talking about things like Dolby surround sound, where you have 5 channels of audio. But basically the idea is we can kind of follow movement, we can follow time and space based on how we hear the sound and the perspective of that sound, how it reaches our ears to be able to tell if something is close by, far away, distance to our left or to our right, or what have you. And it's a really cool effect if you can make that work within your production. So let's take a break here. We'll continue on and we'll kick off section 3 of the notes over in part B of chapter 15.